Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. I'm your host, Amanda, and my amazing co-host is...
Hello, I'm Megan.
Hey. All right, so we are your source for messy, imperfect homeschool advice and community. And when we say imperfect, we don't mean the advice is bad advice, but rather it's just rooted in reality, and what homeschool actually looks like for so many homeschoolers.
Exactly. We don't perpetuate Instagram and TikTok BS around here where everything is perfect and happy 24/7. We love homeschooling. We love being with our kids. But the reality is homeschooling requires work. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes there are tears. Some days are rougher than others. So we'll be honest and share that side of homeschooling too, because if you're new to homeschooling, you'll have a complete picture of what to expect. And if you're already homeschooling, you'll realize it's not just you. Our kids sometimes cry about school stuff too. Heck, sometimes we cry about school stuff, and that's reality.
This morning, my child told me that I was torturing him, that might be
Oh,
considered torture by the Geneva Convention. For the record, it was just that I expected him to continue redoing the worksheet until he actually got an 80%. I was like, homeboy, I hate to break it to you, but that is not actually torture by anyone's standards, I don't think. But okay.
I'm just thrilled your kid knows more about the Geneva Convention than our current administration does. So,
Well, yeah,
you're doing
right.
something right.
There is that. There is that. And so if that wasn't the perfect segue, the other thing that you can expect here is a space that is 100% secular, inclusive, and progressive. We do not agree to disagree on human rights.
Mm-mm.
We do not support the dehumanization perpetuated by the current administration. When we say things like we're pro-choice, we mean we're pro people giving birth when they want to. We're pro feeding hungry children. Hell, we're pro feeding anyone who is hungry. We're pro affordable health care for pregnant women and newborns, and honestly, everyone else. We're pro affordable housing, not corporate overlords who scoop up all of the housing and price the average person out of safe living conditions and solutions. It means we are firmly pro women's rights and trans rights. And we definitely won't be tolerating racism, misogyny, casual, explicit, or otherwise homophobia, transphobia, none of it. We're not doing any of it around here. So if you have been feeling like you are on some twisted version of hidden camera anytime you hang out with other homeschoolers, you've probably found the right spot.
Exactly. I feel like the recent Artemis launch really just shone a spotlight on the huge divides within the homeschool community and really the US in general. I saw a post where a person, and I'm paraphrasing, basically said, how are you talking to your kids about this launch and how it isn't going to the moon when we supposedly have already been to the moon? And the whole vibe of the post was the moon landing is fake, it's a government conspiracy, all that kind of stuff. So stupidly, I headed to the comments like that old Michael Jackson gif where he's munching on the popcorn. And I was naively thinking, this woman is going to get torn to shreds in the comments. But no, I'm the idiot in this circumstance because the statements agreeing with her dominated like 90% of the comment section. I'm not even kidding. By the end of it, I was like, it's not me, right? Like the moon landing was a thing. Like I literally, you could see how people start to get twisted because I was like, oh my gosh, what is happening here?
Mhm.
But that's just how bananas the comment section was. So
Yep.
of course I took a screenshot and I sent it to Amanda because she doesn't waste her time in those sorts of homeschool groups. But I still like to send little shocks to her system sometimes with examples. That's how I get my kicks during the day.
I mean, editing is probably going to take out my massive sigh when you started on this. So I'm going to say, in fairness, I saw that post before you sent it to me,
Oh,
but it didn't have very many comments yet. And so I was like, maybe it's going to be fine. But honestly, many of the ones that were already there told me everything I needed to know about it. And I just noped on out of there because we talked about it in just a recent episode. I've only got so many spoons. I'm not arguing with strangers on the internet, but I do still worry about how are we ever going to turn things around as a society when we're dealing with this level of like, my opinion is just as valid as your facts. And like, when you change your mind based on new evidence, it's proof science doesn't work. Like, or that's the scientific method. I mean, just putting it out there. I don't even, I don't know. Yeah, okay. That's another soapbox for another day. So anyway, a few episodes back, it was mostly the Amanda show because I talked about homeschooling with chronic illness and how to support friends and people in your circle that are also homeschooling with chronic illness. And obviously, since I'm the one with chronic illness, Megan mostly got to just sit back and sip her pink lemonade and nod along. Today, our roles are going to be reversed a bit, which I'm not sad about. We are going to be talking about unschooling today. And so, yeah, as the aggressive academic homeschooler, I get to mostly sit here and save some spoons, sipping my tea, which, if you listen to that chronic illness episode, saving spoons, always welcome, especially because if you're watching on YouTube, you can tell. But if not, I did, in fact, wash my hair for this, which is like so many spoons. So, yeah.
Yes, you save your spoons today, and your hair does look lovely. So you really do just get to sit there and look cute and sip your tea. It's going to be good. If you haven't listened to the chronic illness episode, if you skipped it because you're like, I don't have chronic illness, this doesn't apply to me, you should go listen to it. The last I looked at it, the numbers were low, and it's not just for people who have chronic illness. Amanda talked about the fact that it can certainly be applicable to people who have other circumstances in their life that limit their spoon quantity. And it also talks about how to support friends who have chronic illness. And we are a community of people who actually give a shit about other people. That's part of our thing. So, there's probably someone in your life who has chronic illness or has something going on that's similar or impacts their life in a similar way. And it would be great if you knew better ways to support them. So yeah, go check that out if you haven't. But yeah. So, okay, unschooling. It's interesting because we've identified as unschoolers for so long, and I just kind of, okay, we're unschoolers, whatever. But after almost 2 years of hosting this podcast, I've had some revelations about unschooling, and today seemed like a great time to talk about them. So we'll be diving in shortly. However, we start off all of our episodes with a recap of our week. It's part of our anti-influencer, keeping it real vibe around here. Some weeks are smooth sailing. Other weeks can't end fast enough. Either way, we're going to tell you about it. So what's happening in your world, Amanda?
Well, when I'm not busy torturing my child over freaking math. Yeah, I really, I, I just need more time. I need more time in my days. This current chronic illness flare that I'm dealing with means I've got way, way fewer effective hours in a day. And so I'm just struggling. But then I need more like days in a week and I need more days on the weekend. I just, I'm so behind on everything. It's getting a little ridiculous. But, I don't know. It is what it is. So, yeah, we have been enjoying a modified spring break, which for us means loads more play dates, less schoolwork, though we are still doing some. And for the most part, my kid is loving it. I don't know anyone, grown-ups, kids alike, who don't like a couple of weeks where it's like, yeah, I have to do some stuff, but I can just kind of take it easy and do whatever. But his complete lack of a schedule has left me really struggling to find any meaningful chunks of time that I can actually tackle my own to-do list because it's just all over the place when suddenly he needs me for something, or I'll just get settled in to do something and then he's ready to work on his math, or I'll just get settled in and he'll be like, oh, don't forget that I still want to go to chess this week. And I'm like, of course you still want to go to chess. That's wonderful.
I didn't forget or assume you weren't going. Not at all. Love you.
I'll go put clothes on and we'll be out the door in 5 minutes. And so it just means my to-do list is like getting worse and worse. And he's generally happy as a clam. So yeah, next week we really need to buckle down and somehow get back into a good schedule that works for both of us and kind of get back onto like our regular schoolwork. We're headed towards the end of the school year. Most people who have any sort of school year calendar imposed on them, whether it's classes or a charter school or whatever that is, we all know that we're kind of sliding into the school year. And so it can be a little hard to to buckle down and get some of those things. We still have deliverables that we have to provide and things like that. So we do have to get some stuff done. The reality is it's not likely going to happen in our home. I talk a good game, but next week we also have to do 4 days of CASP, which for anyone who doesn't know is state standardized testing in California, but also in many other states, 17 or 21, something like that. States use this CASP/smarter balance testing. So, yeah, truly, I'm mostly just in survival mode over here. And also looking at math alternatives because we are reaching a breaking point. It's that, I don't know. It's so hard. Anyway, yeah. Well,
Mm.
anyway, my math woes. What's going on with you, Megan? What do you got going on?
Oh, I feel you on the time thing, but
Mm.
at the same time, I've talked about it throughout this year. I've been trying to fit more time for myself in. And so I feel silly saying I don't have enough hours in the day, but like tomorrow I'm going to go get my nails done, which is only the second time I've gotten my nails done in over a decade. And the first time being like a month ago. And so I'm really trying to fit in like little spots for myself. But then it's that thing, I think, especially if you're somebody who sucks at carving out time for yourself. Like my kiddo had asked me to do something and I've been like trying to find a time slot to kind of fit it in. And I was like, well, I get to go get my nails done. Like, that's okay. And I told him I'll get it done over the weekend because I had some other stuff happening tomorrow too. And whatever, but it's like that thing of not only not having enough hours in the day to get the things that you actually have to done, but then trying to fit in things where you actually carve out some time for yourself, which I'm awful at. And then being like, well, now I've complicated this even more. And there's guilt associated with that and all that. So I do not have chronic illness. So my things are just very, very different. But on my own twisted reality, also could use some more hours in a day. And I would still like to get my nails done. I
And
started a Pinterest board with nail designs. Yeah.
oh, well, that's fun. But
Yeah.
I mean, I think that that is kind of like a universal
Yeah.
problem. And for anyone who is tackling a lot of things, it is more common in the kind of like mom arena, but it is certainly not by any stretch of the imagination exclusive to moms. But you see all the time the ones that are like, well, how do you manage everything? How do you have it all? And it's like, I don't I don't manage it all. There is never a point in time where I actually have all of the balls in the air. Something has
Mhm.
always fallen. I have always
Mhm.
dropped something while I'm juggling everything. It just is what it is. Doesn't
Yeah.
make it any easier, but it is what it is.
And for my 18 years of parenting so far, I've been the ball that gets dropped the most often.
Yeah.
And so I'm really trying very hard not
Mhm.
to continue that, but it's
Yep.
hard. So yeah.
Yeah. For real.
So as part of my self-care routine, if you will, or attempts, I finally made a dentist appointment. If you've been listening, I am paralyzed, petrified of the dentist to the point that I need a pill, hyperventilate, sometimes vomit. It's really bad. So I found a dentist here who literally will just knock you unconscious for anything you want. It's not cheap, but I'm like, go, yes, please sign me up for that thing. But I have had a hole in my tooth for couple of months now that is big enough that I can feel it with my tongue. And so today I got to see a picture of it. It was like the Artemis thing where they were naming craters. I could name this hole in my tooth. So they didn't do anything. That was the only way that I agreed to go to the dentist today was if it was just like a meet and greet and tell me what's wrong with my tooth and don't touch me beyond that. And so that's coming. But yeah, what else? I finally sucked it up and texted our landlord about repairs that need to be made. If you have listened to us for a while, you'll know that January was record rainfall in Lisbon and we had water coming in everywhere because we're on the top floor of our building, which is not uncommon. Every Facebook group that I'm in for people who live in Lisbon was like, how many buckets do you have out? It's old, right? Everything is old. And so they've put an entirely new roof on the building because the damage was so extensive. And they acknowledged that there was damage inside, but they hadn't followed up on it. And I also hadn't because it's going to suck. There's so much drywall
Mm.
work that needs to be done. And drywall work is so messy. And it's in 3 separate spaces. And our
Oh.
apartment's not that big. So 3 separate spaces is like half the apartment. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So finally the other day I was like, I just have to text and be like, what are we doing about this? So yeah. The other bit of fun that we have had this week that I would recommend to anyone, there's a new dinosaur documentary on Netflix. Morgan Freeman narrates it. We're not finished with it yet because it's multiple parts, but we started watching it and without any prompting or organized effort, my kids started mocking the information in the documentary, pretending that they were MAGA Republicans. And they were like, surely that's impossible because blah, blah, blah. And we all laughed so hard that it just continued. And I would encourage you to put on any science documentary and learn in reverse by putting out stupid theories
Mm.
instead of, we laughed so hard. We had the greatest time ever. So it was an absolute blast. Highly recommend to all.
All right. All
Yeah.
right. Huh. Okay, so before Megan starts talking about unschooling and finds a way to slip vision boarding into the conversation, because let's be real, she always does, I
Mhm.
do want to get in a quick and exciting in our world announcement. So, for well over a year now, we have been working on a book for progressive secular homeschoolers. There have been periods where it just sat collecting virtual dust in our Google Drive because life, but it is 98% done. And we have a book launch date set, and we've got a nice lineup of fun launch activities planned. So if you have been following us for any period of time, you know that we host a book club and we have read a lot of books about homeschooling, parenting, education in general. And we're super excited because this specific book that we are creating isn't going to just stop at theory and info dumping. So we had started with this idea of like just this little, 70, 80 page ebook that would be quick and easy to pick up. And we will have that. We are still working on that. We're wrapping it up, but we're going to create an actual full all in manual that has that and then so much more. So it's not going to be this thing where, like a lot of books will be telling you the difference between Charlotte Mason and unschooling, and you're going along with it and you're getting psyched or overwhelmed, depending on where you're at about homeschooling. And you're like, yeah, yeah. And then, like, that's it. Like, it just stops there. And now you have to try to figure out, like, where am I going from here? It's like if you were reading a travel book about Turkey and you're all in and you're enjoying it. And then all of a sudden you're instantly transported there and you have no hotel and no local currency and no tours booked and you have no idea how the transportation system works and you don't know what app they use because Uber is not working and they have something different and you're like, what do I do? Like, I know a bunch of stuff about Turkey, but now I'm standing in the middle of a crowded market and like, what now? Our book does not do that. So, like I said, about 1/3 of it is actual reading and stories and anecdotes from our personal experience and our thoughts and suggestions. But then 2/3 of the book is this hands-on planning and activities and checklists and, well, hopefully for everyone who picks it up, it will go well beyond theory and dig into the actual how. How do you confidently do this? What are your next steps? How do I make this homeschool thing like really work for me? Not the way that Amanda does it, not the way that Megan does it, but using their experience, how can I apply it to my life and my family's dynamics and our makeup and my kiddos and their learning styles? So, yeah, we're super excited about it. A few random things to keep in mind. Keep following along because we'll let you know when pre-orders open. We will let you know how to attend some specific launch activities and events that we're doing and just lots more. But in the meantime, you know how I said that the book was like 98% done? Well, one of the remaining things is the title. So we have some finalists and we are currently running a poll over on our Patreon page. It is linked in the show notes here, so you can head over there. It's open to the public, so anyone can go vote. You do not need to be a subscriber to vote, and we would really appreciate as many opinions as we can. That said, if you're over there on Patreon and you're like, oh, this isn't so bad, go ahead and sign up for the free membership. If you do, you will get the monthly newsletter. I put together this spiffy monthly newsletter that goes out to folks every month, and it doesn't require any kind of paid membership. It's for the totally free membership option. So, yeah,
Mhm.
go check that out. And so, without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Megan to talk all about unschooling and probably vision boards, but.
You never know. All right. Unschooling. Now, I will say, as I prepared my thoughts for this episode, one of the hardest parts for me was that I had no intention of being judgmental. We aren't about being judgmental here. don't get us wrong. There are times where we talk about things that are blatantly neglectful or abusive, and we call that out. And yes, we have no problem judging child abuse, as no one should. Okay. We are very loud about the fact that you don't have to homeschool just the way I do or just the way Amanda does for you to be doing it the right way. There are so many shades of color in the homeschool rainbow. So, how do I talk about the spectrum of unschooling without coming across as if you're on the other end of the spectrum as me, you're fill in the blank? People might interpret that as everything from doing it wrong to lazy to delinquent to neglectful. And that's the thing I don't want to do. So, I'm inviting Amanda. If I go off my mental track and start sounding like a judgmental asshole, you let me know. Okay. So, just interrupt me and be like, stop being an asshole. The other thing that I want to say is I know there are success stories on the other side of the spectrum of unschooling as where I am. I know that for a fact. I've talked to people who are living proof of it. So I think the key thing to remember is there are people who are very traditionally homeschooling their kids the way Amanda is, or other people doing it their way with oodles of structure. And it can be a hot mess. Just because they have math textbooks doesn't mean it's going well. And then there are radical unschoolers who are also a hot mess. But there are people traditionally homeschooling, radically unschooling, who are doing it incredibly well. So I think anytime you go, well, I met this one person and blah, blah, like that's not representative of a whole system. And so we really can't do that as a whole. So let's start out with unschooling. What is it? Because I see that all the time in groups. I'm new. Can someone explain unschooling? And I get that. It's a little bit odd, but it's kind of like asking how long is a piece of string because the answer is however long you want it to be. But let's start with the name. And I'm going to invite Amanda to tell you a little bit about the name. And the only reason I'm going to toss it to her for this is because the name was coined by John Holt. And while neither of us are John Holt fans, particularly, Amanda really has a special place in her world for John Holt. So you want to tell us a little bit more?
John Holt. Yeah. Anytime I see someone who's like, to understand how to homeschool, you have to start with John Holt's book. I'm like, or
Please
not.
don't.
I'm like, and Amanda nopes on out of there. But sure, let's start with John Holt. All right. So in fairness, he did first coin the term unschooling back in the 70s. The name is a twist on a marketing campaign that was really popular at the time where 7-Up was positioned as the un-cola, so an alternative to Coke or Pepsi. Unschooling is an alternative to school. That was the idea behind the labeling. However, today you'll hear all kinds of variations on the term. You're going to hear things like delight-driven learning. I got to say that one makes me want to throw up a little in my mouth. Child-led learning, interest-led learning, fun schooling, life experience learning, relaxed homeschooling. I feel like that's a little misleading, but that's a whole other story. Child-centered learning.
Yeah.
You'll hear child-centered learning a lot. Passion-driven learning. Again, I'm like, okay. So if you're seeing those terms floating around, the person is likely some variation of unschooling, especially if they're leading with that. Like, I'm an aggressive academic homeschooler. We are definitely eclectic. There's a fair bit of child-led learning in our home because my kiddo gets to pick the curriculum that he prefers. He gets to pick what we're studying in science each year. A lot of it is child-led or child-directed. But when I'm telling people about our learning, I'm not leading with the fact that it's child-led learning. I'm leading with the fact that we're quite academic. We have textbooks. We have a lot of structure and that kind of stuff. So that is very much not unschooling. And I am very much not an unschooler. So I can say that I see a lot of perspectives out there about unschooling that are things like there's never any curriculum, there's never any structure, and kids do whatever they want all day, every day. And in fairness, I definitely do see posts in groups where that's true. There are people who are unschooling in that way. But since my lot in life somehow brought me to being business partners with an unschooler, I know that that's not a complete picture when it comes to unschooling.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, I see those posts too, where that perception of unschooling plays out also. And I've joined Facebook groups as an unschooler where I feel like I'm on hidden camera, where I'm like, oh, I am in the wrong place. So, yeah. So let's talk about the spectrum. So, all of homeschooling is a spectrum. Visualize a long straight line. And I'm going to talk about this line a lot in this episode. So, draw it in your head with a Sharpie. Okay. So, as Americans, we read from left to right. So, I'm going to work from left to right. Okay. I'm going to designate the far left side of that line as radical unschooling. And we'll talk more about that. Then I'm going to designate the far right side of that line as school at home. So Amanda is not a school at home person, but she is probably further to the right on that line than center. I am not a radical unschooler, but I am definitely further to the left on that line than Amanda is, and definitely left of center. So would you say that's a fair description? I don't want to miscategorize you.
No, yeah, that's for sure fair. We definitely aren't
Okay.
school at home people, but I'm not fundamentally opposed to looking at state standards or utilizing standardized tests. I'm definitely not fundamentally opposed to brick and mortar school, whether that's public or private. And as an aggressive academic homeschooler, our regular course load is for sure going to look much more closely aligned with traditional schools than many other homeschoolers. So, yeah, we're not all the way
Mhm.
at the end as the school at home folks, but we're definitely closer to that end of the spectrum.
Okay, so on the left side of that straight line where unschoolers hang out, I'll divide that in about thirds. And I say about thirds because as unschoolers go, I would venture to guess that many of us do not like hard lines written in permanent ink. So the thirds probably blend into each other a little bit and blend gently. On the furthest point of that unschooling section of the line, you have radical unschoolers. So what does that look like? It's fully hands off and a very extreme interpretation of unschooling, or perhaps the intended interpretation of unschooling. I'm not sure. I never sat down for coffee with John Holt. So I'm a sucker for a good religious cult documentary. I just finished one today called Trust Me, the False Prophet on Netflix. Totally worth watching. But anyway, in those terms, let's carry out religious cult documentary. Radical unschoolers are the most extreme within the unschooling world. They are the most extreme in that area, and that's where they would be represented. So the radical unschooling bunch values maximum autonomy for their children and hold deep, deep, deep trust in child-led development. Oftentimes, when you see people talking about how unschooling is neglectful or lazy or doesn't prepare a child for the real world, this is the visual that they're speaking about. Note, I'm not saying that because I do know of radical unschoolers that have very successfully unschooled. I do know of train wrecks, but I know of train wrecks across the entire line of homeschooling. So there you go. Then you have the middle ground of unschoolers. They're relaxed. They tend to offer some exposure. Most decisions in this area of unschooling are kid led. Parents might step in occasionally. Then you have our final classification of unschoolers. And if you go back and visualize that long straight line, this is the group that is closest physically to the homeschool crowd, the more traditional homeschool crowd that uses curriculum, has a schedule, requires things. So, albeit they're closest to the most relaxed end of homeschoolers, but we're inching our way closer to that section of the long straight line and away from the radical unschooling bunch. So before we started this podcast, I wouldn't have used this term. But as we've engaged in more and more conversations through this process over the last 2 years, I've come to call this segment of unschooling intentional unschooling. And full disclosure, this is where we fall. So you'll know my perspective. In this segment of the unschooling population, many parents are acting as guides or taking on a role that I describe as being similar to what a life coach would do. Skills are typically supported in intentionally unschooling. So things like reading, communication, life skills, practical math application, those are being fostered, albeit through very child-led routes, but those things are occurring. So it'll look different than it would in Amanda's house, but we're not leaving it completely up to the kids to figure those things out. Intentional unschooling oftentimes looks like a partnership where there's a really, really strong relationship between parent and child that's rooted in trust. This approach still relies very heavily on intrinsic motivation, which if you've listened to us for any period of time, you'll know is my jam. Anytime we bring up things like rewards and blah, blah, I'm like, I start to get a little squirrely. So there's less, you have to do this thing because I said so in this world, then I envision what happens to the right of us on that long straight line. I don't live on that end of the line, but that's my vision from working in this field for a really long time. It is typically important for parents in this segment of unschooling for their kids to feel respected, seen, heard, supported. Kids are very much at the center of this, even if there's a little bit more parent involvement than there is in some of the other areas. So when we think of education models, we are typically basing our thoughts and framework off of structured European systems. That's where our education comes from. But interestingly, if you look at tribal structure or indigenous children throughout history and the way that they've learned, it resembles unschooling a whole lot. So there's a person named Barbara Rogoff. She's an American academic based at UCSC out by Amanda. You two should link up for coffee and talk about unschooling sometime, Amanda. She's a psychology professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And her research focuses on different learning between cultures and bridges in psychology and anthropology and all that. She would be a cool person to have coffee with, I think. But
Yeah.
yeah.
In fairness, it would be a very interesting conversation.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I mean, there's always something to take away from a conversation, right? Yeah. So, what she noted in her research of cultures that are not based on Western or European standards of education is that children are learning through observation, through participation in real work. And I'm not talking about coal mining or working in fabric mills like back in the day where we tried to abolish those things. Storytelling, imitation. There's adults in their life who are modeling skills, who are inviting participation, not forced, but just bringing them into the fold. They're given increasing responsibility at points where it feels organic and natural. And learning is just very much embedded in their daily life through social and collaborative experience. And all of their learning is quite purpose driven. So it does kind of sort of resemble unschooling. It's just a different approach. Now, before I go on, I'll freely admit that when I talk about unschooling, as I said, my only lived experience in this space is intentional unschooling. And I fully acknowledge that radical unschoolers, in keeping with my FLDS analogy, would call me a false prophet. It's unlikely that they would recognize anything that I'm about to say as unschooling. So just know that as I speak going forward, this is my perspective.
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting because I would say I personally, Amanda, the aggressive academic homeschooler, I would say that you're more in the middle of the unschooling spectrum. And part of that goes back to what people would say and how they identify themselves and what other people, have to say about how they choose to identify themselves. But I definitely see a lot of people who feel really strongly that they are unschooling but still have parent driven subjects. We talked about this before in the podcast. Most specifically, math often comes up, but sometimes it's ELA skills like writing or entrepreneurial stuff, or maybe it's tech and like coding. And I know that hardcore unschoolers would say that you can't do that. You can't have a parent driven subject and still be unschoolers. But if we're talking about it being a spectrum and all of homeschooling being a spectrum, if it's truly a spectrum, then they are overlapping with the far, again, we're using our analogy here, so like the far right side of the unschooling spectrum. They're not all the way to the left. But if that's the case, then I feel like that would push you more to the middle of the unschooling spectrum. But also, I will also say I'm pretty big on teaching a broad set of many skills and topics with depth where my kiddo has interest. But I just feel like humans generally live such long lives, especially now, that it's almost mandatory to be able to flex between all sorts of things for both survival and general happiness. And for me, that broad skill set just helps. But if you definitely embrace your kiddos having much more of a narrow set of skills with the idea that if they ever need something else, they can learn it when they need it. I just don't fully, yeah. Like as an intentional unschooler, like, but maybe more in the middle of the pack on the spectrum, the best way to put it. But like, it feels like, I guess basically the whole thing feels like herding cats at this point.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, it's funny because your observation, I don't disagree with your assessment because the line we're discussing is imaginary and the spectrum is quite blurry and all of that. So it's fine. But it's interesting because when I look at people who require, it's usually, in my experience, it's usually math and ELA. And then
mhm,
they're like, we're unschoolers, but we require math and ELA. To me, I'm like, that's not
you're not
unschool,
an
right?
unschooler.
Like,
Yeah.
so
Mhm.
that's like a prime example because unschooling is a full lifestyle in the same way that homeschooling is a lifestyle different than traditional education. So it's like when we see people who are like, I homeschool on the weekends or I homeschool over summer break or something like that. And it's like, that's not really like a thing. There's a Facebook group called Almost Unschoolers. And I marvel at it because I'm like, I don't understand how you, or sometimes people say, Friday is our unschool day. And I'm like, you shift your entire mindset around education for one day a week? That's pretty it's pretty intriguing. But I mean, like I said, the line is blurry and none of it really matters. You might get sacrificed in a group if you say you're an unschooler who requires math, but I'm just saying, right?
Yeah.
But I will say, I will add an excerpt to the show notes, or I will attempt to, from a book that I co-wrote with my daughter. It's called Unschooling from Both Sides of the Story, where she described how she learned her core subjects through interests. I say I'll try because I've never really tried to push the envelope on how many characters you can put in a show notes box. I don't know if there's a limit, but I'll do my best to add a really solid chunk so that you can see that you can do core subjects without necessarily having that parent requirement. But I'll do my best. If not, I'll put a note. We'll find a place. Maybe I could put it on a Google Drive or something, and I'll give you a link to a Google Drive. That's my backup plan if it doesn't work. Okay.
Okay.
So I think a lot of unschooling boils down to the balance between freedom and support. When autonomy isn't paired with support, kids can end up with limited exposure, which can impact confidence and preparedness as they move into the wider world. So it's kind of like that old saying to me, like, you don't know what you don't know.
Mhm.
So unschooling operates under the premise that kids are naturally curious and can self educate. But you can only be curious about things that you know exist. And
Yeah.
so I think exposure is a huge part of avoiding this potential pitfall of unschooling. Notice I said potential pitfall, though, because there are absolutely radical unschoolers who will find that information and seek out things that they don't know. It's a spectrum, everybody's unique, etc. So, but yeah, I think we're going to talk more about that balance between support and autonomy today.
Yeah. Well, I do think the exposure part is really important. For me, that goes hand in hand with that previous discussion we had, I don't know, months ago at this point about homeschool oversight and
Mhm.
preparing kids for an open future. But I do personally struggle with how well or not most unschoolers are providing all that exposure. I, as a non unschooler looking from the outside in, especially in late stage capitalism, I feel like providing a plethora of exposure is a privilege available to only the most financially stable.
Mhm.
And I do think for a lot of unschoolers, the parents have to be just so incredibly involved to make the most of this intentional unschooling situation that you've created. And it seems that this intentional unschooling, super heavily parent involved thing makes up a large portion of the unschooling spectrum. And so then the difference for me, again, seems to be more about how parents or caregivers are involved, that like mentoring and guiding without accidentally leading. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
Yeah, and I agree that privilege plays a tremendous role. I mean, we hear stories about people who get a perfect score on the SAT with a library card. There are possibilities, there are things that happen, but that takes an incredibly special person with a lot of intrinsic motivation to have that happen. And so it can be. I mean, we are very fortunate. My kids have traveled, my kids have stood in incredible historical spots. They've listened to authors speak. They've done that, and that is not available to everyone. So I would agree with that. But, our whole vibe is telling it like it is. So I will say that that role that you're talking about, where parents are so incredibly involved and mentoring and guiding and providing exposure and all this kind of stuff, requires a lot, a lot of energy. And it goes up the more children you have, obviously, because they're not all on the same roadmap. So my kids are older now, and so they're much more heavily involved in finding opportunities and researching next steps. But even at 18 years old, 17 in 2 weeks, which is crazy, and 14, I am still doing a ton of this. When they were younger, I feel like the stakes were lower and the programs were typically things that were closer to home or online. Now that they're older and they're really drilled into things that they like and trying to get higher level information that they can't just get online or YouTube anymore, they really need experts in that area or courses that are very specialized that they're looking for. That has become much more time consuming. The stakes are much higher now. Programs sometimes are local or on Outschool, but I also have kids participating in programs around the world. So even at this age, it's exhausting to function at this level of on demand educational resource support life coach. I will be very honest with you if you're in this intentional homeschooling section of the line.
Yeah, I can totally see that. We did an episode a while back about the hidden labor of homeschooling. And I mean, all of it can be very tiring and you're taking on a lot. I know I personally do a lot of my planning in the summer for the upcoming school year. We talked about that and why I do it that way in that chronic illness episode. But then, of course, we have meetings with our charter oversight teacher. So those require prep. And the kiddo and I are regularly touching base to make sure that things are working. And then we do these quarterly meetings where we kind of problem solve and tweak or retool. But generally speaking, throughout the school year, there is a general plan that we're kind of sort of following. I mean, again, homeschooling is flexible. Anyone who tells you that you can't be flexible in homeschooling needs to do some deschooling. So we are definitely like flexing and tweaking and
Mhm.
readjusting and all of that all of the time, of course, but we are still working off of kind of like an annual roadmap that's already been created. And I think something that probably surprises a lot of more traditional homeschoolers is when you talk about being busy with all of the logistics of summer programs and camps. And then, how lately you've been talking about being busy planning stuff for the fall, because even though you unschool, the world at large works on a roughly September to May school schedule, and your kids do like to and prefer to take part in things that function on that calendar too.
Mhm.
So I think with all of that, you're probably on a bit more than a lot of homeschoolers might realize, because that life coaching, partnership, development piece, and then also all of the scheduling and planning. A lot of homeschoolers, like me, who are to the right of you on that line, that spectrum we've been talking about, probably have that too. But just with the more like nebulous nature of unschooling, I think that constant behind the scenes work stretches maybe a bit further than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, I think that that could be the case depending on the circumstances. Obviously, everyone's personal circumstances and situation are going to be unique, but for me, I know that's the case is that I'm on basically all the time, right? And in order to really feel like I'm fulfilling their needs at the highest level that I want to and feel like I can. So tiring, but it's what I do. It's a choice that I made. So there you go. Now, I did mention earlier that you'll see a lot of unschooling is child neglect, or unschooling is code for lazy parents who just don't want to put any effort into educating their kids. So I feel like we need to talk about that. And again, going to try really hard not to be judgy as we dig into this world because that is not my goal. I will freely admit that I have ended up in unschooling conversations where there's no known medical issue or learning difference that's at play. Although I will add that I think in the radical unschooling world, it would probably be very difficult in some cases to identify learning differences. And so that could be a real situation. But I have ended up in conversation where there's kids who are 8 and 10 years old who are not potty trained yet because the parents are just kind of waiting for them to figure that out and to feel intrinsically motivated to not pee in their pants. That part sounded judgy. Sorry. 10 and 12-year-olds who aren't reading yet because they haven't taught themselves. And again, if you're just like waiting for that to happen forever, your kid could be like profoundly dyslexic, right? And so, but if you're kind of in this world, I feel like that could be really hard to identify also, but okay. I am aware of situations that are occurring where kids are being expected to prepare for life in a vacuum, to your point about exposure. And while I do obviously support the core principles of unschooling, that kids are curious little beings, right? That also requires the right environment. And in the right environment, they can learn way more than people give them credit for on their own. But I am of the mindset that they need access to things like literacy and communication tools and opportunities to engage in the world for that curiosity to really spark and come to fruition in its fullest capacity.
Yeah, I mean, that's it, right? I know that I support you and your kids. I think you're doing great things and they're doing great things. I just really struggle with this. It is not my thing all the way around, which is fine. We can agree to disagree on stuff like this because I know your kids aren't being neglected, and this isn't a fundamental human right. You're not telling them, no, you can't explore whether or not you are LGBTQ, like, no, you can't do this. No, it's not about that. So we can agree to disagree on this. So this is one of those, okay, we agree to disagree scenarios, but I I do think a couple of things. One, there are a lot of kids out there who need scaffolding and repeat exposure and practice to be able to get good at things. And a lot of kids don't naturally say, like, oh, well, I really sucked at that, but I'm going to keep trying until I get better. So, with gifted kids or kids that have natural ability, I can see how it works really well, but I can see how it could be really hard if the parents kind of are set on this, like they're going to embrace it and have the intrinsic motivation to do great with it, and their kiddo is a kiddo who doesn't or can't for whatever reason, and there doesn't even have to be something quote unquote wrong in the picture. Some kids just need more scaffolding than other kids,
Mm.
and it feels to me like unschooling doesn't have a lot of scaffolding for a lot of things. And then I also feel like unschoolers really need to consider, if a child never learns to read, the question isn't, did they choose that? It's, were they fully supported in having that option?
Mhm.
Again, kids are still kids. We talk all the time about how their brains aren't fully developed until their mid 20s. So, are you making sure that your kids have access to opportunities as young adults? And again, that idea of open futures that we talked about in a previous episode. And I think the support is crucial in these situations. Like, yes, kids are curious, but like I said, they're still kids. Like, most kids don't want to fail. Most kids aren't like, I'm going to keep working at this thing that I don't like, that I fail at, just because it's important. Well, like, we aren't, neither one of us, you as an unschooler, me as an aggressive homeschooler, like, none of us are aiming for a Piggy and Ralph a la Lord of the Flies situation over here. You know what I mean?
Okay. I get side eye for vision board discussions, but you get to toss around the classics, like, ugh, the classics. Oh my gosh. I will say, while you were having that whole thing about scaffolding, my brain was examining scaffolding in our lives. And I realized that there's a new process that I've put into place with one of my kids for something that's new for him. And he does need a lot of scaffolding and benefit from that. And so every day we've been getting together for 15 minutes. It's a really easy, I shouldn't say that because it's not easy for him, which is why it requires scaffolding, but it's a task that doesn't take a lot of time. So every day we get together for about 15 minutes and just buddy system it basically, kind of body double it. And so we record late in the day because I'm 8 hours ahead of Amanda and he's an older teen. He's up late at night, but still I just sent him a text. And I go, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I realized that we forgot to get together for your thing. Do you want to do it now? You can come in between this and the meeting that Amanda and I have after this, and I can help." So it's literally reminded me that I missed a scaffolding step today, but we're going to get it done. So it's going to be okay. So yeah. So here's the deal. If you're new to homeschooling, you're like, I don't even know what's happening here. Unschooling Charlotte Mason. What are these two people talking about? We talk in other episodes. We've talked about it in our online courses about finding the philosophy or the approach to homeschooling that best fits your family. There are these online quizzes that you can take that will tell you what your natural tendency is. We have them in our courses that are online too. If you're like me and your quiz comes back unschooler, which it did, I immediately was like, yeah, that's not the case. I'm not going to just not teach my kids things. That's insane. And then I took like 6 more quizzes because I didn't believe it. And they all came back the same. So, yeah. But if you're like, okay, so the quizzes said I'm an unschooler, how can I do this intentionally? Let's talk about ways that you might be able to do that. And let's kick it off with strewing. You want to talk about strewing, Amanda?
Okay, sure. So we can start with strewing. But before I share a bit more about that, I do just want to toss out there, if any or all of this is allowing you to just imagine a very different way of approaching homeschooling and you want to go deeper with it. Megan does offer coaching sessions to help you just find your way with unschooling and figure out where you might fall on the spectrum that we're talking about. I mean, we offer a huge range of coaching sessions. I can help you find the most rigorous math curriculum or the least rigorous math curriculum because your kiddo needs way more scaffolding. And the two of us can meet with you to talk about how to better understand your philosophy and where you want to go and how to plan out project based learning objectives or really just create a game plan for how you're going to intentionally de-school. We cover all kinds of things with coaching. So if you're listening and you're like, yes, but I need more because look, basically a podcast can sometimes be a bit of an info dump. And then you're out there trying to figure out our topics and how to squeeze them into your own life. And it's not really working and your goals and your kid. And you're like, but it doesn't really line up. We get it. And coaching can get really personal for you and your family and your kids and all of the dynamics and the different things and just really granular in our private coaching sessions. So you can find all the details right in the show notes here. I hate going to show notes because I'm usually doing a million things if I'm listening to a podcast and I do not have time to go back and look at it. Later on, you can always go to our website. It's homeschoolmomsunfiltered.com. There's a little thing in one of the headers that talks about like private coaching or something like that. That'll take you to it. So yeah, you can look that up and check it out with lots of different descriptions and things. So anyway, back to strewing. I will start off by saying that strewing isn't just for unschoolers.
Mhm.
It can work for any type of homeschooler. We did a whole episode on just strewing a while back. So we won't go super deep into it here. If you want more information, obviously scroll through the podcast and find the one, it's in the title. But strewing is essentially the concept of intentionally leaving resources, books, tools, puzzles, project kits, opportunities to create anything that might spark interest around, just kind of leaving them in places for your kid to pick them up on their own in their own time. It's this idea that taps into the fact that kids are curious and will go, what's this? That looks kind of cool. And then pick it up and dive in.
Mhm. Yeah. Another thing you can do if you're looking to more intentionally unschool is to offer opportunities. It can be things you find and go, ah, this is right up their alley because it's tied into some interest of theirs. Or, and I would say equally as important, can be something from far left field that you toss out there just to see if it lands. It goes back to that you don't know what you don't know concept. A kid might not even know that Ren fairs exist, but might show up. And the next thing you know, you're buying a sewing machine so that they can cosplay at the next one that's 3 counties over. And suddenly you're on a road trip and you're part of the Ren fair community. These things happen once exposure starts.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's it. If you're talking about exposure, you can find new and more interesting and in depth resources around interests. But it is just as important to kind of push beyond that, right?
Mhm.
That exposure. You start in the comfort zone and then you're taking steps outside of it. Sometimes it's little steps, sometimes it's giant leaps. Neither of us are Minecraft households, but so often when we talk about interests, we hear the only thing they're interested in is Minecraft. Well, okay. So use that as a jumping off point and start to explore things like maybe architecture in the real world or things like coding and how you might make your own game or storytelling and how that might be similar to Dungeons and Dragons or something like that. You can take that idea and extrapolate out into baby steps away from Minecraft and into giant leaps that are still connected.
I love that idea. And I think all of that goes back to family culture, which I've talked about so many times, but basically that you're living in a household that's rooted in modeling curiosity, that you're curious as well and you're trying new things and you're not afraid to fail and you're stepping outside your comfort zone and always excited to learn something and not beating yourself up over things that don't go well. So creating a super rich environment where kids can flourish in these ways, I think is huge. Perhaps think about it like a garden. You know those European gardens, even if you've never been, but you watch something like The Duchess, I think it was called, on Amazon Prime with Keira Knightley, which, oh my God, everyone should see. It's such a powerful feminist movie. But, those English gardens that are filled with shrubs that form mazes and topiaries that are super structured and carved. And then there are people who turn their front yards into pollinator gardens and they're filled with wildflowers and different species and colors and all of that. And the goal of their garden isn't beauty, but pollination. Both are beautiful in their own way. Both take skills and knowledge to create, but both are very different landscapes. So I'd liken more traditional schooling to the curated garden and unschooling to a pollinator garden. And if we're going to continue that analogy, because I'm really having fun with my analogies today, I'd encourage you to take a moment and think about what would flourish in a place like a barren parking lot or a gravel pit. Not a ton. So the environment that you've set is key. I think when people start homeschooling, their number one focus is almost always curriculum. And I get that. It's the thing that we know because that's what school is centered around. But whether you're unschooling or homeschooling, in my mind, the environment is the layer that goes beneath the curriculum and really sets the tone for everything else.
Well, yeah, I think that's a great analogy. No matter where you fall on the spectrum of homeschooling, you'll get the best results if you're nurturing the soil and tending to the weeds before they become a problem and doing your best to protect the garden from the harshest of storms that roll through. Yeah, I think that's a great analogy.
Is puberty the harshest storm that you're referring to? Is that what is that what we're after here?
I mean, it's one of them. Let's be real. It's definitely hurricane level nonsense. All right. So I have a lot of thoughts and strong opinions. So these next questions, I made sure I ran them by Megan before putting them out there. So that said, I think an environment aiming for intentional unschooling, it's important to ask some questions along the lines of, am I actively exposing my child to new ideas? Do they have access to skills that expand their future choices and options? Am I stepping back or am I checking out? And if my child continues on this path, what doors are opening and what doors might be closing?
I love those questions. Yeah, I do. 2 years of working together, you get me, right?
Sometimes.
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 Now, there's one more big component that I think we need to discuss before we wind down for the day, and that's the overlap, which is pretty darn big, between unschooling and neurodivergence. Amanda and I are both neurodivergent in different ways and homeschooling neurodivergent kids, which I thought was really interesting when you brought up before the idea of gifted kids being this self starter. And I've talked to so many people who are like, my kid is gifted. And I'm like, then set them free. Just let them go because they will find all the information. If you watched that movie Short Circuit in the 80s with Johnny Five the robot, a lot of gifted kids who've been set free turn into Johnny Five, need more input. If you haven't watched it, that needs to be added to your family movie night. It's quality 80s movie time.
And let me just say, if you're listening to us and you're like, I do have a gifted kid and they have no motivation at all whatsoever, it is probably because traditional schooling really doesn't encourage them
Mhm.
to want to learn or go deeper on anything. Because when they asked the deeper questions, the teacher was like, no, you're wrong. Just learn this thing.
Or
Just
stay
memorize
focused.
this thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Just memorize this thing. And so then they're like, well, what's the point? So it does take a little bit of time to kind of deprogram that and get back to
Mhm.
the like, whatever you're interested in, you can go as deep as you want. My kiddo just wrote his research paper. He's 12. He just wrote his research paper about Stalin and his early life and how his early life probably influenced his rise to dictatorship and left it open ended for a much bigger paper of comparing him to other dictators and
Oh, I
that
like that.
thing. That is not a thing that a kid who is sitting in a boring traditional classroom is going to be like, hey, I wonder if I look at Stalin's early life and how his parents were, and if that will, like,
Yeah.
there's a difference no matter where you're at and what you're doing. And if you need help with that,
Yeah.
come talk to us.
Yeah. We do
We're
that
happy to
thing.
do that. Yeah.
Yeah. But we look at most topics here through a lens of neurodivergent. Why? Because the rest of the world is always focusing on the neurotypicals, what's good for them, their preferences. They tend to dominate a lot of the conversations. So we like to make sure that we elevate the dialogue about neurodivergent individuals across the board. But yeah, there is often a really big overlap between neurodivergent kids slash parents and unschooling. I can personally speak to the fact that going through school in a very traditional and religious education system as an undiagnosed ADHDer affected how I look at education. I freaking hated school. I did what was required of me, not an ounce more. Hello, there's your example. I did what I needed to in order to make sure my parents were happy, to make sure I could continue playing sports because you had to have a certain grade threshold. And that was the end. It was a means to an end. It was something that I was required to do. So I went through the motions and I did that thing. I have learned way more as an adult and become an avid learner as an adult because I was set free of that system. So, why do we think there might be such a strong correlation between unschooling and neurodivergence? Why do so many neurodivergent kiddos thrive in this system? And I think it's because it breaks down a lot of the walls that exist in the public school system, or traditional school, I should say, not just public school. But you don't have arbitrary timelines. Things like you have to be reading by age 6 or you're behind. There's a huge psychological impact of that sort of discussion and push and thinking. There's typically no standard pacing that neurodivergent kids are either trying to race like they're in a hamster wheel to keep up with, or they're being held back by because they're in a room with 20 other kids. My youngest one would be like, I got this an hour ago. Why are we still talking about this? And so that can be pretty challenging. And you might have a kid who falls in both of those sections, right? Because asynchronous development is super common in all children, but it's much greater in neurodivergent kids. So another factor is that it reduces the failure feedback mechanism that so often exists in the traditional world. Neurodivergent kids tend to struggle more with failure and grades. They take them so personally in some instances. There's constant comparison. Don't get me started on a fucking behavior chart system with the red, yellow, and green clips. Do not get me started. Thankfully, my kiddo, who would have been on red all the time, never made it to public school, right? The first two that actually did go to school were model classroom kiddos. My oldest hated school, struggled through school as far as the environment was concerned, but he was always on green because he's a pleaser and he's going to follow the rules. My third one is going to ask the questions that would not have been welcome. So there you go. But the problem is that when kids struggle in an environment like that, they're not sitting there going, this environment does not serve me and I am not great at school. it tends to be boiled down into a much more simple language, which is just like, I suck, I'm bad, I'm the worst. And that is identity shaping in all of their different stages of development. And I don't think too many people would be like, yeah, that's totally what I want for my kid. So if you have a kiddo who's every day it's a struggle for school, they're an ADHDer and that you're just fighting and fighting and fighting with the school for accommodations, that's what's in their head most likely. So not great. Unschooling honors interest-based learning. I mean, hello, neurodivergence and hyperfocus are the thing. So guess what unschoolers get to do? They get to hyperfocus their ass off. And it's now considered this really cool strength that you have where you know everything there is to know about this rare breed of spiders from Madagascar. Ask me how I know. And it's not a problem that needs to be solved because you're not keeping up or you're not on topic or something like that in the traditional world. So for neurodivergent kids, what looks like an obsession is often the most efficient pathway to learning that they have. It's just a very different thing. So they might go super deep into one thing and then they're like, oh, I've satisfied that curiosity. And then a couple of days later, they're reading a book that you've strewn in the house and they, oh, this is interesting. And now they're super deep into that thing. And so it's a different style of gaining information. But the neurotypical world doesn't often understand that style of learning. Unschooling often supports sensory and regulation needs. Now, homeschooling, as we've said, in general, is already flexible, and unschooling is way more flexible most of the time. So, all the dysregulation that your child is experiencing from must do's and systems and structure that aren't serving them potentially don't exist in unschooling. So, you're good. Truly, they don't have to exist in other forms of homeschooling too. You can accommodate, you can
Yeah.
differentiate, you can do all of those things. So if you're doing it this way because that's the way it's done, no matter what your homeschool philosophy is, you can also be helping your child out of dysregulation. And I would encourage you to do so. Unschooling can often protect mental health. All of the things that we just talked about tend to lead to less masking. If you're not familiar with neurodivergent masking, it's basically acting like a neurotypical to please the neurotypicals, and it's freaking exhausting. So masking and a whole bunch of other stuff leads to burnout. It gives kids more autonomy. In really extreme situations, this can be super harmful for your kids. And so unschooling might be a way to reduce that harm that is occurring. As a person whose oldest child was significantly harmed by the traditional system, this is a really big deal for me. And like I said, he's gifted. He wasn't struggling academically. He was a model student. He wasn't a behavior issue, but he was dying inside. And so this is a really big thing for me. So all of that can be achieved by removing harmful practices, but still maintaining support and access and guidance. To Amanda's question before, like, are you stepping back or stepping out? Wait, what was the question? I forget. It was something about like, are you stepping out completely or,
Are you
right?
stepping back or checking out?
Checking out. There you go. You can provide all of those things without checking out. You can still be there and provide support. So the next time you're engaged in some sort of heated debate about unschooling in a Facebook group, I think it's important to remember a couple of things. Not everyone is aiming for the same educational outcomes, and that's okay. And that's true no matter how you're homeschooling. Having said that, we can still talk honestly about what different approaches lead to and who benefits versus who might be harmed from specific approaches to homeschooling and or unschooling being part of the homeschooling spectrum. Also, we got through all of that and I didn't mention vision boarding once, but I will say it was a big part of our homeschool journey, and we did an entire episode about it that Amanda loved. And so you should totally go check out that episode that we recorded a while back because it was fantastic, if I do say so myself. And then I would like to leave you with a few people who were self-directed learners, people like Agatha Christie, Frederick Douglass, George Bernard Shaw. There's so many, so many who were self-directed learners. So it is possible. I think it takes a specific approach for it to be super successful, but it's possible. So our mantra to end today's episode and end Amanda's suffering of talking about unschooling is trust your kids to be curious, but support them enough to turn that curiosity into capability. And don't judge what you haven't taken the time to understand. And that's just good advice for everything in life. Okay.
Yeah. Don't judge what you haven't taken the time to understand.
Exactly.
Please. Just
Right? Man. All right. So if you have any questions about unschooling, you can pop them in the comments. You can come join us on Patreon. I will chat with you about unschooling all day long. You can book a coaching session. There's a link in the show notes to the book that I mentioned about unschooling that my daughter and I wrote. And I'll put the chapter preview thing there. So yeah, check it out and come talk unschooling. I could talk about it all day. So let's have some fun. But in the meantime, happy homeschooling, friends.
Yeah, have a great one.